My name is Martin Purnell and welcome to Off-Grid Christianity, a weekly podcast for those who go or don't go to church and where we can meet and hear from those that have made their faith count. This podcast series is to encourage via conversation and not necessarily change your mind prior to listening. You can contact us as well by email ogc@accessradio.biz. That's ogc@accessradio.biz, and biz is spelled B-I-Z. So please enjoy today's guests, one of which is returning, having last appeared in episode 6. Both are married, and fortunately for this podcast, to each other. Since episode 6, our guest has had serious health issues. Our other guest has had to be caring and loving throughout this time. A book entitled Gotta Die to Live was published just after COVID with a tagline, An Outer Trip and Inner Journey. And one of my guests was my boss, and so I mustn't reminisce, even if the story of why he could have sacked me is rather good. In 2025, we'll see him on our TV screens presenting a series on suffering and redemption for God TV. So why write a book? What do the titles mean? What does suffering and redemption mean to them? What have they learned so far about marriage, themselves and God? What are the aims and objectives of their new God TV series? And what does this quote mean? What he does in us is more important than what he does through us. It gives me great pleasure to welcome, especially to one of them who hasn't been on here before. That's Kerry Cole and her husband, Chris Cole. Thank you guys so much for joining us. For those that don't know who you are you and where do you live?
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Martin. I'm Chris. I got the deep voice. We live in sunny Cornwall. We've been living here since 2006, but we started our business and ministry in Plymouth, which is just the other side of the Tamar. So it's kind of local for us.
And Kerry?
I'm Kerry Cole, and I've been married to Chris for 42 years. I am the mother of 3 children, the grandmother of 4, and I like creative arts.
And no doubt we'll hear more about that later on and about your book as well. But before we get to some more pertinent questions, 5 not so pertinent questions coming your way. And because Chris has already done this before, we've gone now to the next phase of different questions. So, fingers on the buzzers, no conferring. Beethoven is teletransported to your home, and he wants to hear what music is like in 2023. Now, obviously, my teletransportation machine has corrected his ear problems, so he can hear. What gig concert would you take him to, please? Kerry, what would you take old Ludwig to, please?
Well, it would be a Jamie Cullum concert, and I would make sure that it was nice mellow jazz, and, well, it would be, and especially listening to Pure Imagination.
Good answer. Would that be just on his own or with his backing band as well?
Definitely backing band.
Because you then have to explain to him, see that funny looking instrument over there? That's called a saxophone, Ludwig. Because I don't think saxophones were out in those days. Good answer. I wonder what he'll think. Chris?
How come going back in time heals his hearing problems?
If my teletransportation machine can bring him forward, I can heal him as well at the same time.
Lovely.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Just so I understand. I'd probably take him to a Bob Dylan concert where definitely they were playing Slow Train Coming album, which was Bob Dylan's most definitive album when he made a commitment to Christ. And the album has a track in it called Slow Train Coming, which builds into why Kerry wrote the book Gotta Die to Live.
Oh, and you just happen to have a book there for him translated into German so he can take it back with him afterwards, which is a shrewd move. Good answer. Because most people who are Bob Dylan aficionados don't like his 3 albums he did as a Christian.
They don't like Bob Dylan. I mean, he was quite a heretic when it came to the folk scene and then onto the electronic scene. So he's quite an enigmatic but an amazingly interesting character, being born Jewish. He's what they call a Messianic Jew in his commitment to Christ. A great thinker. The reason for Bob Dylan, for me, Martin, is God used that album so powerfully at my own personal conversion.
Thank you, Chris. Question number 2. If you could go back in time and watch any sporting or entertainment event live with a front row seat, what would it be? Chris, we'll go with you first, please.
I'm really boring. It would still be Bob Dylan. I'm very faithful, very committed. I like an entertainment business with substance. And I think Bob Dylan brought substance into the entertainment world, the music world, back in the late 70s. It's the way I'm wired.
Can I just say the next question about a biblical character? It can't be Bob Dylan as your answer, just say.
No.
Yeah. Kerry.
I would go back for nostalgic reasons to the first ever production of the Nutcracker Ballet.
Oh, in Moscow, was it by chance?
I don't know where it was, but that's what I would go to see.
Just thinking, because Tchaikovsky wrote it, didn't he? Why, out of all the ballets, would you choose the Nutcracker Suite?
It's because of the sweet storyline. Just something very lovely about childhood memories.
Yeah.
It was a little child's world, and I haven't really looked at it since.
Question 3 then. Kerry, if you could invite any biblical character for an evening meal so that you could ask them questions, who would it be and what would you cook?
Adam, and it would be apple pie.
Very good. And what kind of questions would you ask him then?
Why did you not say to Eve, no, thank you?
Yeah.
And by the way, would you like some of this apple pie? Here's a chance to say, no, thank you.
Obviously, you could then explain to him that you've made it with Bramley's, which is an apple he wouldn't have known back in those days, and the sugar content. And then you could explain to him, do you have cream with it, or custard, or ice cream? I mean, he's in for an absolute delight, I would have thought.
But I can't distract him, because if I distracted him with, would you like cream, custard, ice cream, or whatever, it might distract him from saying no to the apple pie.
Well, I think that's great. As a matter of interest, when you have apple pie, what would you serve it with?
Custard.
That or ice cream? Chris, who would you invite for questions and what would you cook them?
I would invite the Apostle Paul, because that man, I think, went beyond the field of duty. I think really the way he lived his life, what he went through physically and practically. I'm amazed at the man's just commitment to his faith, No apple pie in that, no colour, but that's the way I'm wired, Martin.
But what would you serve him?
Cook him a meal. Probably lamb stew.
Yeah, that'll do. Or you could really push the boat out and, offer him a bacon sandwich, see what would happen.
Yeah, well, he wouldn't accept a bacon sandwich.
Don't you think so? Even though he's like a new creation sort of thing now.
Yeah, but they hadn't progressed that. Bacon would have still been a serious problem, I think, for Paul.
Perhaps just not preferred.
Yes.
What, you think he would not prefer it?
Yeah.
Right. I wouldn't want to put him into that difficult situation of making a decision, because I want to ask him and build relationship and ask him some deep questions.
Turkey bacon.
Turkey, but yeah, could have done that, yes.
We didn't have turkeys back then in Israel. They didn't, I don't think they had turkeys back then. You'll have to research it, Mark.
I can answer that. Turkeys didn't come over until like the 1800s from America, because that's where the bird is native.
To us, yeah.
And the reason we call them turkeys, the story goes that the Turkish community would bring them over to the UK to sell in the 1800s. And so we called them turkey, named after them who were selling them. There you go.
Well, why do they call them turkeys in America?
Good question. I don't know.
I would like every listener to fact check this interview, please.
I'm just thinking, though, if Paul was offered by you a lamb stew, you could just imagine turn around and say, actually, no, you haven't got any apple pie, have you? Question 4. What do you remember most about your wedding day and why? Let's go with Chris, first of all, please, on this one.
I think what I remember is we didn't know how we were going to get to our honeymoon location. Everything was so amazing on our wedding day. But I think as a guy, kind of making the decisions of like, well, how do we get there and bits and bobs? It was like, how did we get to the honeymoon? Now, that was a technical thing I was thinking of. I mean, the way Kerry and I met, I think, was so supernatural anyway, because in her book, she saw a vision of me when she was on a bus. And I saw a vision of her when I was in Brussels reading the book of Romans. And so in a way, we feel we were put together before we even met.
Yeah.
So for me, the whole marriage was part of something much bigger. But I suppose you could pick so many things out of it. That was one of the things I thought, how are we going to get to our honeymoon? Do you remember that?
Yeah, very much.
I don't even know how what's his name came up and said, oh, I know what he said. He said, I've been so amazed by your wedding.
Yeah, a guy walked up to me and he said, I've so enjoyed your wedding and been so amazed by it, and had a really good conversation. And he said, how are you getting to your honeymoon. And cut a long story short, he offered to drive us down, and he did.
From
we
Plymouth
shared,
to South Cornwall.
and we shared all about
All the way down.
your conversion to Christ, didn't
Yeah.
we? All the way
Yeah.
down. It was really special.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If that bloke is listening, please let us know whatever happened to you. That'd be fantastic. So that's what Chris remembers most about his wedding day. What about yourself, Kerry?
I remember sunshine in November, the sermon, which was amazing, and the fact that I put my veil on myself. And I remember my mum coming up to me and pushing a hair grip down during the wedding because I had it sticking up through my hair. I didn't have somebody to do my hair for me, and I kind of just did it myself. I had a hair grip sticking up that obviously my mum saw and thought, wow, that needs fixing.
Did you know that, Chris?
No, I've never heard that story before. Well, thank you, Martin, for these questions.
Question 5. What do you consider to be your favourite film of all time? And if you can't do a favourite, I'll accept a top 3. And I'm just thinking that Chris might choose a film with Bob Dylan in. Kerry, what are you going to go for first?
I'm going to go for The Sound of Music.
Oh, very good.
And the reason I've chosen this is because it's fun. It's delightfully entertaining with all that beautiful colour and singing and romance. And it's very exciting. And based on a real story too.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's an all-time classic.
Yes.
Can I say when it's based on a true story? Not the Mary Poppins mystical bit, but I think her name Travis, who wrote it, really wrote.
You're on the wrong story,
yeah.
darling.
Well,
you're
what am
talking
I-
about Mary Poppins.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, you said The Sound of Music. I'm sorry, I missed it.
The link is, of course, Julie Andrews. That's why you said. So then, Chris, what's your favourite film?
Really simple. Lord of the Rings,
Oh, okay.
including The Hobbit,
Okay, that'd be a top 4 then. Yeah.
The Godfather,
Oh, which one?
the trilogy,
All 3 of them, yeah.
all 3 of them, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think Denzel Washington
Yeah.
in that film, I can't even remember the name of it. I was watching his son, John David Washington, in a film
Yeah.
that's just come out called The Creator, about AI. But it was where he was, the Book of Eli. Thank you, Mrs. Cole, for remembering. The Book of Eli. And it was a good, clever film, because I think Denzel Washington's got a great faith. And it's a bit like Mel Gibson. He's controversial as Mel Gibson, but you can't knock his influence. Passion of the Christ, what he's bringing out, other stuff.
Yep.
Just as an interesting side, the Passion of the Christ cost 60 million, raised over 600 million as an R-rated film, the most profitable R-rated film ever produced.
Well, we call him our Denzel over here. in
It's all
our
now
household.
Denzel.
Our Denzel. If there's a film with our Denzel in, we always watch it. Well, thank you for that. Top 3 films, and you had at least about 7 or 8 there.
I did, didn't I?
It was very good.
Getting the best out of your answer, isn't it?
In our day, we'd have called that the 12-inch version as opposed to buying the 7-inch, which is fantastic. That's my kind of language. Let's move on to more pertinent things, if that's okay. And I would love to know more about, Chris, in a minute, your public theology degree that you've been doing. But it's, I think, only fair that we bring people up to date for Kerry to join in as well, because it's one thing to go through serious health issues, but people forget just how much of a knock-on effect that is to their loved ones. Chris, tell us, please, what's happened to you since we last spoke to you in episode 6.
Well, in 2022, in researching part of my doctorate, I was looking at the persecuted church, because being involved in media, we now live, as Daniel said, in a time of increased knowledge and communication. And all the media, faith-based media work I'm involved with, you're aware that any nation can stop your internet, but they can't stop satellite television. I'm really touched by the amount of testimonies I see on God TV of people in nations like India dressed up in their Indian national dress, just talking about the love of Jesus. And I find it prophetically a sign of the times. So looking at the persecuted church, God directed me 2 things. He said, I want you to read the book of Job. And also, right out of left field, he said, I'm going to take care of your 3 girls, which I didn't really know what that meant, to be honest. And then in October 23, I'm one of the leadership fellows at St. George's in Windsor. I was at a conference up there and I collapsed. It was a 4-day conference. They took me to hospital, couldn't diagnose what it was. I drove back to Plymouth. And then at the end of October, I collapsed at home. Kerry called the ambulance and they took me to hospital. And I was in there for 3.5 months and they diagnosed me with myeloma, which is a blood cancer. It's an incurable cancer. But while I was there, I got 3 cases of sepsis. I had 2 urology issues with my kidneys, and I had 2 major hemorrhages. So I was in for 3.5 months, and I think I lost about 40 pounds. And I ended up, I couldn't walk because I was just lying there motionless. Then I came out in February the 10th. And here's the amazing thing. All of my daughters, well, obviously 2 of them live in the area and came to see me, but my oldest daughter lives in Australia. But she had made plans to come over, help the family. But she arrived on February the 9th, 24 hours before I came out. So we had the most incredible 10 days together of just sharing together what the Lord had been doing. And I think I kind of was able to communicate to the girls that although the ministry side had been very exciting of what we had built, you know, what God had built through us over the years, there's also another side of the coin, which is how are you as a father? So you can have the ministry and then how are you as a father at home? That really, I think God really did a beautiful work on that. And I was able to communicate to the girls that, you know, girls, sorry, I didn't take you to as many picnics and stuff as that because my folks were divorced when I was 16. That left a very deep trauma in my experience. And I can remember, like a lot of people of my generation, we never wanted to get married or have kids. So it was only in meeting Christ that all changed. But sometimes, Martin, you can't give what isn't there. And I love my mum and dad. They're no longer here. They gave me the best that they could. But you know what? You can't give what you haven't got. My dad was born in 1929, didn't know his parents, very capable guy. My mother came from a family in Cornwall, couldn't wait to get away from home. It wasn't that you would call a communicative home. My dad wasn't very communicative, and I can't remember much of my mum. So it's quite a detached upbringing. So God, through this traumatic thing, was doing something deep within my soul, which I think is the whole purpose of faith, where you've commented on it, where I say what God does in you is more important than what he does through you, except the kingdom. Your identity is not in your ministry or anything else. Your identity is in the presence of Christ. The most greatest desire for me is to hear from God as often as I can, to be in his presence, which Jesus said, like with his Father, I do nothing other than that I see my Father doing. So even Jesus couldn't do the miracles without being connected with the Fathering. Fathering is a very deep issue within the church. It's a very deep issue within society today. If you study the urban cities of America, part of their problem is a complete lack of fathering, which they themselves would admit.
If people want to know more about fathering, Robert Folson, who was with me a couple of weeks ago on a previous podcast, he's in Australia, he does Men Alive. We discuss more about why fathering is so important. I'd like to bring Kerry in on this. What have you learnt through this process?
I think when you get into a very pressured situation, it draws out what's really there. And so if you've got oil, if you think of a parable of the 10 virgins, it's going to come out. And it's like when you get squeezed, what comes out? What is a crushing can bring out, if you get a rose and you crush it, you're going to get the most beautiful fragrance. And I think with this whole experience, I personally was delighted to find in myself that I had such a deep confidence in Jesus. So it was the most horrible situation. It was frightening. It was very alarming. It was a very long experience with so much trauma all the way through it. And there was no way that I was stoic. I went to the hospital sort of 100 days in a row. I think even things like that are just the physical, it's so tiring. And I spent over £400 in car park fees. And my whole life changed, my whole lifestyle changed. Everything was focused around just being with Chris and being with God in a different kind of intensity. And the beauty I found was this wonderfully deep, secure foundation with God as Father and guiding me through. And the one who I would come home perhaps at midnight and I'd just lie on the floor and weep. I remember one night just weeping till about 4 o'clock and howling out some deep, 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 intense pain, probably intercession, probably. But the beauty, I just knew I was not alone. Jesus was completely, because he's in us, part of the suffering. That's the fellowship of the suffering. God, it's not his original desire that any of us had anything to do with death, had anything to do with suffering. That was not the plan. And so he is intensely, immensely with us in it all. And he hasn't abandoned us. The beauty and the wonder and the horror, the mystery of the cross cries out that God is with us in the deepest, most darkest, painful suffering. So that's what I found when all this kicked off.
Cast your mind back as well, way before this, when Chris was first starting up his ministry, Cornerstone Vision, and then obviously Cross Rhythms and everything else like that. And then we had the amazing times together for the festivals every year in Oakhampton. But you would have seen plenty of things going behind the scenes that I never saw. Where is it going to happen? How much money are we going to lose? Are we going to lose our livelihood? How are we going to put food on the table? How do you explain that to somebody who's listening today as to what you must be going through and what it's like? And then we can compare that to what it was like for the past 3 years for you.
So throughout the journey of our lives, which started very clearly with a call. So Chris had this wonderful and weighty call to reach thousands, no millions, with the gospel through media. And so as he set out with that, and I was very immature in my faith, and in many ways Chris would have been, but he had such a beautiful, pure-hearted zeal. There have been all sorts of challenges and places of finding pots of gold, of deep faith in difficult situations. So when we've had really limited resources and finances to do something that requires a lot of finance, and the pressures on us in that sort of way. So within all sorts of things, within one of our children's health, there was a big challenge. Within just what is within you, the actual fabric of your own soul and the way you process things, your own emotional stability, everything like that, depending on what is there as a foundation in your life. There was so much that God had to repair and strengthen in me as a person, which was very, there was a lot of pain in my life. And so that was very real. But I think it was in those processes that I learned to rely on, cling to, trust in, build my life upon the reality of Jesus Christ and his very real intervention over the years, where you remain faithful in that call and in that covenant. And so within that, it's that scripture, buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you actually have the gold. So you've been through the fire, you've been refined in difficult situations, you have the gold. So you know where to go when it gets dark and difficult. You also know where to go when times are beautiful. So one thing I would say about all of this, when I was in hospital with Chris in the ugliest of situations and pain, I can honestly say that it was no different to me in my inner being, in my soul and my mind and my peace and my mental state, than if I'd been sitting on a cruise ship with Chris dressed in a nice outfit, eating the most beautiful meal. It would not have been different seeing Chris in septic shock, because Christ in me is the same, and he is beautiful. And one isn't better than the other because Christ is beautiful. It's not about the things or circumstances in this life that make us happy. It's the deep inner peace of having Christ as everything.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that, if I may, Martin, because I think this is why, looking at the situation globally, 360 million brothers and sisters in persecuted nations, many of them in prison. I think in the Western church, not a criticism, but obviously Kerry and I have still pastor a small church and have pastored a church. The balance of the word of God is there's so much scripture about in this life you will have trouble, or suffering leads to perseverance to character. If we think that the persecuted church, they really are living for the eternal. They know that one day they're going to pop their clogs and come into a completely different realm. And sometimes when we look at the early church before 313, it was born in persecution. Therefore, people were kind of aware of some of these concepts of trusting God in the difficult times. That's why I'd like to talk to Paul, because he really went through some stuff. And it's not a criticism, it's an observation. But as the whole world is being changed by the presence of God, we look at the Middle East and we look at what we're facing, a bit like the 30s. Part of the challenge in the Western world is we have a gospel of God loves you and things are going to be all right. And actually, for Kerry and I, that's absolutely true. We've been incredibly blessed and prospered by God, but it's not the whole story. And the whole story is that the whole of life is ordained to change us on the inside. God says, without faith, it is impossible to please me, but I am the author and perfecter of your faith. So God is the one writing our story. So for me, I obviously, studying the public theology, Christ was crucified before the foundation of the earth. It wasn't a surprise to God that Adam and Eve were going to rebel. God knew that. I mean, God knows it. If he's God, he knows everything about it. But I kind of arrived at a state that the whole purpose of our life, in the good and the bad, and this is Romans 8:28, everything, Martin, works for the good, for those who love Christ, called according to his purpose. And I think that's what's so important about individual Christians knowing, as the Apostle Paul said, the church is built in Ephesians 2 on the apostle and the prophet, with the cornerstone being Christ. Every single one of us who's a Christian has a purpose. We need to find out what that is and seek that out, because that purpose takes you on a journey where God can build a deep relationship with you and basically build something of his presence, his peace, his joy. That's why I'm so, we go back a long time, Martin. I'm so encouraged by what you're doing with these podcasts. That is possibly part of the prophetic word, because of the media. Because the media now, for a next generation, that's how we're beginning to communicate. Our missionaries can't always go abroad in some of these hostile, but the media, the radio, the television, and the local media can.
Well, I'd like to take it a bit further, if that's okay. In light of public theology and like what you've been saying and what Kerry's been saying as well, take it further. But and no doubt you know people personally who had a Christian faith and then one thing led to another, let them fall away. And one particular friend of mine that really, really struggling with his own bad health. His wife's health is really, really bad, constantly in hospital, and they have no time for God anymore.
Yeah.
So how do you counter that? And what would you say to them? Kerry, what would you say first of all?
First of all, we're all individual. And I think to try and put your own thoughts or your own way that you think people should respond or behave, I don't think that's helpful. But I do think that our testimony is a light and can be a light. When Jesus spoke in parables, he knew that some in the crowd were willing to hear. He said, if you have ears to hear or eyes to see, and everyone there had ears and eyes, and if they were deaf and blind, he healed them anyway. So in general, in those sort of, in those days when he was walking around. So what I mean by that is I'm just assuming everyone can hear and see that he's speaking to, but he says, you who have ears, you who have eyes. And he knew that some would just harden their hearts and they wouldn't listen. And some would be open to what he was saying. And I think we've got to remember that not everyone is going to respond to the message in the same way. So we were at a meeting once and this wonderful preacher preached this beautiful message on the Father heart of God with such passion and authenticity. And at the end, and I think it's probably the only meeting I've ever been in where this has happened, at the end, most of the people in that room stood up and clapped when he'd finished this. It was so sweet, it was so godly, it was so edifying and beautiful. And then we all went off for coffee, and Chris and I were sitting with a couple of women afterwards at this little table, and one of the women said, "Oh, wasn't that just amazing?" And we were like, "Yeah, it was fantastic, wasn't it?" And this other lady said, "I didn't get anything out of it. I don't know what you're talking about. I found it really boring or bland, or I didn't really think anything that he said really touched me." I think that is the biggest illustration. Now, I went through a very difficult time when one of my daughters was 10 and she had cancer. And my response as soon as I knew this information was to grab hold of God's hand and squeeze it ever tighter and just say, "Father," and I knew he was with me and I knew that he was the one I wanted. He says, "I'll never leave you and I will never forsake you." And he is with us. But I think sometimes maybe our fathering situation, our parenting situation doesn't make him appealing as a parent. It might be that we've been rejected. It might be that there's been no comfort in our lives. And I think that's what God might want to heal in some people's hearts, is places where they don't expect. They've been abandoned, they've been rejected, they haven't had parental help. And I think God, as a loving Father, would so want to address that for people, to pour his love in and to say, in this trauma, I so want to be with you. I so want to help you. I so want to be your friend in this. So I think sometimes that might be one of the reasons why people walk away from God in times of trouble. I feel so blessed and fortunate that in my heart, I ran to God in that time of trouble. And I just feel privileged that I could do that, but I would not impose that on anybody. I would just feel compassion. I wrote this little piece of writing called "Walking with God When the Sky Turns Black." And I think for me, that is where God's heavenly umbrella is bigger and he holds me tighter, if that's possible. It was like, I'm going to run and cuddle into my best friend and bury my head in his heart and his chest and just be closer to God. I need him to get me through this. And I'm not going anywhere else. I'm not going to drink. I'm not going to smoking. I'm not going to overeating. I'm not going to anything else to comfort me. I'm running to my Heavenly Father. But like I say, I think for some people that needs healing.
I'd like to encourage you, first of all, Kerry, if that's okay, because your daughter, who is seriously ill, as you know, my wife Alison had very similar cancer of the thyroid, and I nicked an idea of yours, which is superb, because your daughter every hour on the air had something to open up.
A little present open up, yeah.
During the isolation, yeah.
So I got people to write stuff and presents and everything else like that, so they had something to do. So if you know anyone that's going through it or about to go through it, it is a fantastic way to encourage them when they're in the isolation ward for 3 days, as Alison was. So Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Martin, in what Kerry's saying there, I mean, the thing is, the power of everything we're involved with in this amazing life, with God being the King of the universe, is love. God is love, not the way we understand love. But I'm thinking of your friend, because I've just read a testimony of somebody who very similar 30 years ago had a faith, was going on, something happened, walked away from God, 30 years later came back. And we've just had his testimony on Cross Rhythms. Louis Palau said this before his passing. He said at his rallies, I'm not bringing you to a religion. I'm not even bringing you to Christianity. I'm bringing you to a person. And that person is Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ is 100% divine, 100% human. And, you know, his purpose on the cross was to open up a doorway for us to have the same relationship with God, our Father, as he had. Now, we've also got to see the parable of the sower. Sometimes the seeds, people can make a commitment, even have an experience of Jesus. And then sometimes we in the church love the people. We're trying to say, it's going to be great. But actually, that's not true. In this life, you are going to have trouble. And as we grow, sometimes God allows things to happen for our maturity. And I agree that every individual will stand before God in his or her own account for their life. I mean, God, that's it. It's not, you can't blame the church because the church is full of broken people. The very simple essence is that Christ has an intimate relationship with every one of his children. And as we've already said, everything works for the good for those who love the Lord, called according to his purpose, which is why I'd like to sit down and talk to Paul. Nobody exemplified that life of commitment than Paul. I mean, taken out of the city, stoned, dead, people around him, prayed, raised, goes back. I mean, he really took it physically, but he would have been prepared to have gone to hell for the sake of his people, the Jews. Amazing love. So the old hippies, the Jesus people movement, it was about love, but we got to know what love is. Foreigner's Track. I want to know what love is. It's a great track and it's a good song. I think it's kind of prophetic for a generation. I want to know what love is. Love that is not self-centered. Love that is not about you, but love that actually has the power to change the world, which it is today, especially around the world in the persecuted church. They can only exist because they know a God of love. We sometimes in the West know God as a God of consumerism. What's in it for me? And there is something in it for us, but that shouldn't be the purpose of the relationship. There's a level of immaturity in that. You've got to grow. It's not about what's in it for me. It's what's in it for him, because I trust that he will do something powerful in our lives. And he's done that with us. We've been tremendously blessed. And I suppose the only way I can handle the prognosis of my health at the moment is because I have enough kisses from heaven that God would bless us. When we started the festivals, we put our house on the line. It wasn't a noble act. It was just like Kerry and I were so naive and innocent. We put it on the line and God saw it. And we have been blessed by God without seeking the blessing. Seeking him, you get the blessing, but you get it in the way that he authors your faith, if that makes sense.
Thank you, because you're knocking out of the ballpark there, this prosperity evangelism, because you're actually being more specific on that.
Yeah.
And what I'd like to do remaining time is to show that actually we're all different personalities, because I can't actually stand the Foreigner Track. I know what love is. That's the thing.
Yeah.
With different personalities, we can't conform to your kind of music, even though we have a parallel. You talk about God is love. Kerry, you're talking about giving personal testimonies and stuff. So in the remaining 10 minutes with public theology that we can talk about as well, where do we go from here? As the old song goes, is it down to the lake I fear? Where do we go from here?
Well, I think Kerry and I feel that we're on our journey, because I agree with you. Do I believe in a God that prospers? Yes. Do I believe in the doctrine of a prosperity gospel? No. Because as we quite rightly say, everybody's an individual. And I've been through there with some of the American televangelists. I won't go into that. But at the end of the day, we can't make a doctrine out of some of these things without understanding that people, as you say, are individuals. The church has to become what the theologians call more of a koinonia, the relationship, how we love each other, how we see each other. The hand cannot say to the eye, I have no need of you. as opposed to the ecclesia, which is the church structure. And I'm into church structure, nothing wrong with that. But the point is, when people come into the church, people have got a testimony, but they need the mums and dads in the faith who don't want to control them, don't want them to build the church, but they really want to help them find their journey and purpose in faith, as you would do your own kids. So I think there's a massive change happening in the Western world. And of course, that prophetic word we had, reaching thousands, no millions for Christ, we think we're coming into that. Our activity with God TV, obviously, how we started with Cross Rhythms, the Christian Broadcasting Council. I think we're in an age where even 40 years ago, we would not have anticipated the impact of social media, podcasts, what we're doing. And my heart is to reach a generation of young people that can hear the truth of the spirituality and not be overly negative about the church. You know, there's a lot out there that's negative to Christianity, but it's not all the truth. So I think for Kerry and I, it's a new season. We feel we're crossing over to a promised land. We're doing far more on media than we have before, on television, stuff with you, our own ministry. We're just doing what God's called us to do, but we're learning to also enjoy the day-to-day. We've got a purpose, but then also we want to enjoy the day and recognize God in the day. And I think Kerry and I have been profoundly, deeply aligned, even more than we're aligned. I mean, Kerry is my best friend. She's my soulmate. We've been on this journey forever. We're kind of 98% really there. We have our 2% of moments, but I think every marriage does. That's the pressure of life, because Kerry's a disciple in her own right, and so am I. So to say that there's this perfect nirvana out there, it doesn't exist.
Someone told me years ago that the definition of a marriage is that the husband could come back one day and say, right, we're going to go to Italy for a holiday, or Australia, or wherever, Antarctica. We're going there. I've checked the finances, okay. And immediately the wife would say, yes, but what about the documentations that we need? What about the food problems that we've got? What about the fact we need inoculations, all these sorts of things? And the bloke's going, no, don't worry about that sort of stuff. But the wife will see a different thing. So in light of you bringing Kerry in and by saying, well, Kerry and I think this, let's ask Kerry now. That's okay.
It is very funny, actually.
Before Kerry responds to that, just answer your question. The difference in many ways between the man and the woman is this: in a marriage, the wife is looking for understanding. It's the way she's wired. The man is looking for agreement. There's your tension.
Well, let's see if Kerry agrees. Kerry, over to you.
I can give the funny answer. I saw this little clip on Facebook not so long ago, and it was a man and a woman in a car going along, and they're going off on holiday, and he's driving, and he looks terribly serious and concentrating on everything ahead. And she is sort of leaping around in her seat and waving her arms and clapping her hands, like, woo, woo, really excited, happy, nudging him and bumping into him as she's so happy. And he's like sort of stoically driving along and ignoring her frivolity. And she basically is saying, oh, by the way, where are we going? And it's like, she is just so excited about the fact they're going on holiday, and he's the one in this case who has sorted the hotel, bought all that's just got the petrol and everything. But what it is doing is it kind of shows that actually you kind of need both. Like if you just had him with all his like brilliant, perfect planning, it would be perhaps a bit of a dull holiday because she brings the party to the partnership. I found some of them amusing because I sort of recognise myself a bit in this rather jolly character. And I'm not saying all of the extremes, but I've been very fortunate with my husband that he has been so meticulous and careful over everything for 42 years. He's taken his responsibilities of the husbandry, of being a good husband. I don't know if husbandry, but he's taken his responsibility unto God in such a beautiful way that I genuinely haven't had to worry about anything like that. I have never had to worry about the responsibilities, that he's providing and he's protected. And I've had the most beautiful environment in which to love and nurture and sort of put the colour and the fun into things. And sometimes we compare ourselves, like he's more of an iron gate and I'm the rambling rose around it. And sometimes the areas of our personalities have really clashed, because a rose would find an iron gate quite harsh and sometimes and a bit heavy. And I'm sure the iron gate would find the rose most annoying in its frivolity of just growing all around everything. And
plus thorns.
Thorn.
It was an Elizabethan rose. It doesn't have thorns.
So for us, I feel I've been very fortunate in having a husband who has really taken a lot of the weight of things that I haven't had to worry about that. And that's been a great blessing for me. I'm just saying, in our marriage, everything's going to be different. Everyone's different. Everyone's giftings are different.
Can I just, because I think also into that, God is there to Christ, Christ the man, the woman, is not a dominant role. But husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church. Wash your wife with the word is not throwing religion at her or scripture. It's actually, as you as a man, if you're called to marriage, are being changed in the power of Jesus. There's more of Jesus to see your wife and to wash her and minister. So I think that ministry needs to go on more in the home too. It doesn't mean you're not accountable to, Kerry and I have been accountable. We're part of a stream and a couple that Tony, Marilyn Fitzgerald, we still relate to them. So there's an accountability that we have. But I think there's also a time where husbands, and it's hard for men in marriages, I think, in our culture, Martin. I would probably have quite a burden for men who run to their sheds, if I could say that. But at the end of the day, men have a responsibility to bring that spiritual environment into the home, wash their wives and the children with the word. Not a perfect situation, but I think it's not just the church that ministers this stuff. I think a husband in bringing Christ into himself and into the home is very important. And that's been the strength of Kerry and I in 42. We minister to each other. Kerry has been the most brilliant carer. Not that I was looking for a carer, but she's been empowered by God to take me through the last 14 months. And she is fantastic because I see she doesn't do it. There isn't irritation. I don't think I'm a demanding patient overly, but she's been brilliant in that. Even those things have actually enhanced our marriage for us to see each other a little bit more deeply.
And again, it's probably what it draws out. One of your original questions, Martin, of like, what does it draw out in you? There's times I used to always go into the follow-up appointments. Now Chris is out of hospital. I used to go into them when they first started up, but now I'll often just drop Chris to them because he's happy to go on in himself, and then I'll come back and pick him up. And when I see him waiting outside the hospital, I'll get tears. I just think, oh, there he is. I just get tears of love well up. There he is waiting, bless him. And it's what does it bring out in you, doesn't it?
I look like a little old man with my stick and my hoodie.
But I think because Chris has always been strong, quite a leader within our relationship. And by that, I mean by taking responsibility of being like a bit of that illustration of the guy just driving the car. We both got a car and I drive. It's not like I'm the little lady and he's driving the car type of thing. Not a bit like that. But what I mean is now I drive him everywhere. It's been really special. It's been really special. And I have to really honour him and make sure I really give him a lot of dignity. And, because a lot of decisions, a lot of power was taken away from him when you can't walk. And so at first, I remember when we got back from hospital, he was beginning to walk and he was then walking quite well, and I would be encouraging him, and because we used to go for a particular walk in a field quite often before he was poorly, And I'd be going, come on, Chris, let's get to the field. And he'd go, oh, I'm in pain. I'd go, come on. I think after seeing him lying in flat out on the bed for months, I was like, come on, I'm sure all your ligaments and your muscles, everything needs to sort of shape up and everything. I'm like, come on, encouraging him and thinking, I can remember one day thinking, oh, I just think he's being lazy. I think I actually told you that. I said, Chris, I think you're being lazy. I think you could walk a bit further. And bless him, we then found out from hospital that he had a fractured back. And,
fractured spine.
And I completely, as soon as we found that out,
repentance, forgiveness.
I did. I just said, Chris, I am so sorry. I really genuinely felt I was helping you.
Yeah.
And I am not going to ask you to go for a walk again. When you want to, that's when we'll go. So you're learning as you go.
So it's the communication, I think.
Yes.
If I'm on a journey with my creator and being changed, then Kerry's the same. Without a doubt, in marriage, you are going to become one flesh. These are the processes that do it. And I think sometimes the church, we need to find a safe place with relationships in the community where we can speak candidly about the good things and the bad things and realize there's enough love in the room to really hear that, pray into that, care for that. But this is what I'm saying. I think Kerry and I would see the last 14 months, though we wouldn't want to go through it again, or I wouldn't want to go through it again, but God's been in it.
Yeah.
God has been in it.
Yeah.
And we have deepened our intimacy through Christ. Christ has deepened through it. So I would say to anybody in the West, don't discard. There's a beautiful book by a guy called Paul Bullmeyer, Do Not Waste Your Sufferings. I think it was written in the 70s. You can get it on Amazon. And it's a beautiful book because there are many people like the Lutheran pastor who was in prison in Romania for 14 years.
Richard Wurmbrand, yes.
Richard Wurmbrand. And his wife. And he has a beautiful saying. He said, any faith that cannot endure suffering is no faith at all. Now, that's an anathema to the Western church on the prosperity gospel. And I'm saying that you can't actually grow. Don't look for suffering. It's just going to come.
And I would also just add that I believe times like this can be a real opportunity for letting Jesus come through us in a very humble way. So where Jesus says in the Bible, if you offer a cup of water to one of my disciples, I just think in the humble things, and perhaps it is a Western world kind of thing, that we can think of success and really doing something mighty for Jesus as being this big thing that the world would consider success. But actually, what if it is the totally unseen act of putting your partner's socks on for them? What if that is the most sweetest, beautiful thing in God's sight? And I tend to think that that is more, well, not more, but because you're obedient to what you're called to, but I believe those things are underestimated, and that actually it is a beautiful opportunity to honor each other. And you've really honored me, Chris. Chris will really encourage me and say to me fairly often, thank you for the way you care for me. And it really touches me. And there's other times I'll notice Chris doing things for himself. I'll say, Chris, well done. The way you sort out your tablets for yourself is astonishing. And it takes such a weight off me. Like he has a hamper of his tablets. He's got so many. And he'll go there several times a day and have to fish out, according to the plan, all the tablets he needs to take. And I'm so grateful that he does that. And it's just honouring each other in the little things that make it all work.
You know me really well and my warped sense of humour. And for me, marriage was defined, husband and wife, with the Simpsons movie where Marge Simpson goes outside to talk to Homer. And he's walking up and she says, oh, how about we do this? And starts talking. And the camera actually starts to go in to Homer and then goes into his face and then goes into his brain. And whilst Marge behind him is talking, all you can see in Homer's brain is a monkey with cymbals going like this. And that's me. That is me. So we've talked about it so many times. I'm sorry, Alison, I'm going through a monkey phase here. What are you over on about?
Yeah.
But the difference between me and you, Kerry, because as you know, I'm a full-time carer too, Alison. I'd like to think I'm obedient, but I've never been willing. And that's been my major issue in all our marriage years, because as soon as we got married, all of a sudden all our illnesses came to fruition.
It's a shock. Yeah.
That's my issue. So I thought
Yeah.
in the remaining minutes, for those that are listening today, that maybe can identify whether it be the Marge Simpson monkey, or it can be the amazing iron gates with the roses climbing all over it. Willingness and obedience. What do you think, Kerry?
Well, I think the thing is, Martin, is it's loss, isn't it? But as what you're saying, you entered into a time of loss. There's going to be a real effect on your own personal soul and journey and hopes and dreams that are very, very, very real for both of you. And without naming who it is, I know someone who cares for his dear wife, and he gets home and he keeps the household and he does all the cooking, and he is incredible, but there's been a lot of loss. And then his dear wife feels so guilty about the fact that he has to do the tasks that she would want to do, that she gets so low and snappy with him, when he actually needs her probably to say thank you so much for what you're doing right now. Thank you for making the tea. But her pain can't say that because she feels so guilty. And so there can be all this ball of pain. And that is so sad when people are doing their best and sacrificing and suffering, because it is a mutual suffering. Of course it is, in that it's a mutual, it's not one is suffering and the other is carer. You're in this covenant and there's suffering in it all, isn't there? I think it's just crying out that the love of Christ and the communication will come into that. And where the coping mechanisms are, maybe with humour or a bit of denial, or just to start to open those things up to God and say, God, I do this. I use humour to hide that I'm absolutely devastated, and just letting come in, because he wants to come in. So that might be a very deep, dark passage through our lives that leads to an abysmal cave of nothing, that we feel like we've lost so much in life. But it's just saying, God, I use this to cover the massive pain. I'm just putting it aside. And that can be one way of really honouring the sacrifice of Jesus and honouring the cross, by letting him flood that place with his light and love, because he just wants to love us. And you might suddenly find so much joy in that place.
That's truth. I mean, when we talk about Marge and Homer, I'm sure it's the truth that sets you free. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. The fact that you could have a conversation with your wife and say that I'm a clanging monkey in my mind, the fact that you can even communicate that as truth, and you're finding the deeper depth, because the love of a marriage should be the place where at least there's the trust between the two of you. And this is hard, and why some marriages don't make it in the difficult times is it's a covenant where you go very deep and how you hear each other, because the wife can then, or Marge could then say, I understand that, Homer, but there's more to me than that. And then Homer can say, I believe that, Marge, and I don't like this monkeys with but that's the way I am, and we got to see why we're like that. Asking the truth. And sometimes in church we try to put doctrine band-aids on each other, which are not deep enough. We have to go to the essence of the broken soul. That's what God is really trying to get to. And at least with the couple that we're describing, they've been married a long time, and it's not just her in difficulties. There's issues where, there are some tough stuff that people are working through. And Jesus is there, but it does demand a truthful conversation and a non-reaction to the truth. Here's where it takes character. Even when the truth hurts you and people miss you, you've got to have a hope that Jesus doesn't. And don't overly react. Easier said than done.
Yeah, it is. It is. Kerry, I'd like you to have the final word, and I think we can sum it up as well regarding your book, Gotta Die to Live, with the tagline, An Outer Trip, An Inner Journey, because I think that's what we've been talking about here. The outer trip from the hospital, marriage, the inner journey inside. What can Jesus do? Let Jesus in. To sum it all up then, what would you like to say about this podcast, please? And then I've got a silly thing to say at the end, but hopefully it'll be a good summary as well.
With the book that I wrote, God, I Died to Live, and the fact that it does say it's an outer trip and an inner journey, the whole years that we've been together, Chris, 42 years, and the wonderful times and the difficult times, and to sort of find this in the latter years, to come across this intense time of pain together and to find out what's within us, within the pressure. I heard someone speak the other day. This pastor was sharing that he had the most incredible meal recently that was sticky pork that had been cooked for a long time in this sweet sauce. And he said it was the most delicious sauce he had ever tasted. And he asked the person who'd made it, what did you use for this sauce? And the guy said, blood oranges. He said, yeah, but what else? It's the most incredible sauce. What else did you put in it? And he said, no, all it is blood oranges. But they have been reduced for 15 hours. And his point was that reduction can lead to the most beautiful concentration of something. So actually, we might fear reduction. You know, reduction can seem like something's being taken away, but is it not bringing forth the most beautiful quality? And I think anywhere where our lives might appear to be being reduced, we might be in a situation like I've said to Chris, we don't see as many people anymore. When one of you is poorly, it's surprising how everything shrinks down, how people perhaps naturally just don't include you in something anymore because they understand your situation and that it's not easy for you to get to something. There's all sorts of dynamics that I think we really need to be aware of, Martin, of what you're saying, where people are suffering, that in that reduction, people's world has become perhaps much, much smaller, much more concentrated. But the truth of the gospel has to be that Jesus is so in that. And, you know, to just slap on the prayers of, oh, let's pray for healing here, which is wonderful. And I believe in healing. And I know there's wonderful things happen and wonderful miracles. And Chris and I pray for our health. You know, we just bring that to the Lord. And that's really important. But in these cases, I think there's a different language of reaching out to each other.
I did mention at the front end that you'll be on God TV. You're going to present a series. Tell me more about that very briefly, please.
It'll be 1 or 2 programs just where Kerry and I have just shared about God in the suffering, because God TV has done a lot of programs on the suffering church, and it's something we're beginning to see and be honored by the fact that there are brothers and sisters going through that stuff.
God TV actually made a special point of praying for Chris when he was in the most terrible situation. One of the members of God TV with his wife came in constantly. They would be bringing communion to Chris. They would be praying. They were so faithful in just being there. They did a live on-air prayer time, just crying out for Chris. He was in such a terrible situation with sepsis. One man I spoke to at the hospital as I was going towards the front entrance, and he was supposed to have an operation and they had cancelled it, so he was going home. And I happened to mention my husband was in hospital with different things, but had sepsis, and he literally ran away from me. He said, I don't want to hear, I can't talk about that. The pressure on people and the difficulty of the situation that we were in, and just the prayer as people were crying out to God. So God TV went through that journey with us, some of them in that sense. And so we are just doing these two slots of about 15 to 20 minutes on each slot that will go into a program.
Yeah. And for those listening saying, I haven't got God TV, I haven't got contacts to God TV, I'm going through similar stuff that you've had to endure. Yeah. What would you say to them, the fact that they can't contact God TV or any other big Christian ministry?
I think that the point about this isn't, well, God TV prayed so Chris got better. I don't think that. God TV have recently lost a precious sister who was a broadcaster, young woman to cancer, and she's recently passed away. What I would say is you're not getting better prayer because God TV are praying for you. It's not getting better prayer. It's just because we were lit on God TV. They just happen to be some of the fellowship that we walk with. And because it's been quite a public sort of suffering, when you're linked with the media, it's been quite a public thing. So our story, there's so many people who've gone through so much who don't get some media outlet to share it. They've got brilliant stories, much better than ours.
God TV if you do connect with God TV, they do pray for people that is there. But you can take a journey with connecting through now with the social media, that you can be connected to areas of prayer. Because I think that's possibly the real reality of what we want to say, is you're not alone in this.
I called up and I did it within 3 days because I just felt the Lord say to me, arrange a Zoom with the people that have been praying. And within 3 days, we had 40 people on Zoom and we were just praying into Chris's situation. And he couldn't walk at that time. And within about 4 days of that prayer meeting, he was in the rehabilitation hospital. He was beginning to walk. So I would say, gather your friends. If it's just 2 or 3, gather your friends on Zoom. 2 or 3 is fine.
Yeah.
Just those people you love and trust, and start to pray together.
And you have to take a step of faith. You have to make the first part of the move, which is what you did. Just so happened to be that you've got big contacts in God TV. But some people might not have. Still take a step of faith.
Yeah.
Just contact someone that you know is a Christian. Say, please pray. And it's amazing what will happen with social media, because that other person might put it out on WhatsApp to their friends, and it's like a snowball effect.
Well, you might get a response to your podcast, Martin, in that sense.
Yeah.
And I think that's why, looking at the detail, you can always help somebody make a connection. But I think what Kerry's saying about people that you love, people that you trust, it doesn't all go through the professional Christian gate. You know, if you've got Christian, you'll take a journey, as you say.
We would know of very famous ministries where people have prayed and the outcome has been not like we would perhaps hope. So it's not about the name who is praying. That was just because we happened to be connected with them and they were caring for us, but it wasn't the whole of the network at all. It was local friends. And
What I would like to say in closing on this, firstly, I didn't know where this podcast was going to go today. And we've focused in on the end on illness and marriage and couples being together, talking it through. We talked about how just talking to people, communication, that can be one of the greatest things to happen now for the future of Christianity in the Western world. Also, like what you said about Chris, about it's not a question just sticking Bible verse Band-Aid on it, I think you called it, because that can then bring in legalism and everything else. But I heard a good story once at a certain festival whereby there were certain rules and regulations being made about the festival that you couldn't bring alcohol into the main campsite or where the stages were. You could drink alcohol in your tent, but you couldn't bring it on there. And the story I heard was that the sound engineer stroke one of the presenters or whatever was actually kipping out in the main arena because they had to look after the equipment. And that person had a stash of beer stored away underneath the table in the caravan that this person was staying in. Everything apparently was going horribly wrong. BT couldn't get the signal out, and this person had been working all his hours of life trying to make sure that a signal could get out of the festival site to go live on air. About 4 o'clock, that person gave up and thought, do you know what, he'll have a can of beer just to recoup. Opened the can. Psh. No sooner had he opened up the can, there was a knock on the caravan door, and the person opens the door, and standing outside was the CEO of this radio station who had made all the rules. You can't have alcohol there. And the CEO looked at the person concerned, looked at the beer, looked back at the person concerned, and that person concerned was thinking, that's it. That's the end. That's the end of my career. Do you know what happened next, Chris?
Well, pretty close to home.
Yeah, because it was you and it was me. And you just looked at the can of beer and you looked at me and you said, I've just got one thing to say, Martin. And I thought, here we go. This is it. He said, where's mine? Point I'm trying to make here is that you could have been very legalistic. You could have got rid of me, whatever, but you saw a bigger picture in here. And it wasn't just a question of, oh, well, it says here in the book, you can't do this. There was a bigger story. And I think that's what we have to learn as well if we're going to converse with people in the future.
It's like life. There are lovely boundaries in life. And some are boundaries you don't want to cross. And I mean, the thing is, we had a lot of movement of the Holy Spirit in our Cross Rhythms festivals, because we had a lot of people that would come and see it as a festival. So we had to put a limit that this was a different kind of spirit. And we definitely don't have a problem with alcohol on it, but you had to put your principles in place on that.
I know too. It was always held on the site
of a drug and alcohol rehabilitation
centre.
It was.
And so I think it was probably to honour.
Yeah, I think it was
as well, wasn't it?
which Gilead, which we were working with
because a lot of the people were helping out.
Yeah.
And so if they'd seen a lot of the drinking, it wouldn't have been it might have been a bit of a stumbling block for them, I suppose.
Which is what the Bible says, it's just being sensitive, isn't it, really?
But the point is, you could have got rid of me.
Not on that issue. No, Martin.
Some people would have. I have no doubt. In the Bible belts, wherever their Bible belts are,
I see what you mean.
they could easily have got rid of me. And what would have happened to me? Who knows? You didn't.
We probably wouldn't be on this podcast.
There you go. Guys, thank you so much for your time. In closing, Kerry Cole, who is your Christian hero, please?
Corrie ten Boom is my heroine. She reminded me of my grandmother in appearance, but I suppose it was just the richness of her as a single woman, how she grew up in the Netherlands with her dear father and her sister Betsy, and they were such deep, loving Christians, and how she looked after children with special needs. What came upon them was obviously the Second World War and the occupation of Holland, and how they loved and looked after the Jewish people and hid them. And because of that, they ended up, these two elderly women, in a concentration camp where her dear sister died. Her story is very inspirational to me. I remember when she actually got out of concentration camp and she described having a bath for the first time. It deeply touches me, the thought of that she could be in warm water and have soap, and the way she described that. And it was her life after that, the way she went to so many places, so many very dark places, so many places that were about to experience terrible atrocities. And she built faith into those people of saying that there is no darkness, that the love of God cannot be deeper still. There's nothing so dark and deep that God's love can't be deeper still. I find her story very inspirational.
Well, that's a brilliant heroine to have, and I'm glad you've mentioned her. And you're not the first, and you won't be the last. Chris and Kerry Cole, hopefully in another couple of years' time, we'll be able to get back together again and talk about your next part of the journey, if that's all right.
Lovely.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's really special, actually, to have someone ask you questions like that. Like, it draws out things in your heart that you're not sure are there. And then when they come out, it's really special. So thank you.
Thank you. And I will look forward to seeing an iron gate with a rose climbing up and a monkey behind it playing cymbals. That'd be fantastic. Chris and Kerry Cole, thank you so much for joining us today.
Bless you, Martin.
Thank you,
Thank
Martin.
Bye-bye.
God bless you.
Next time on Off-Grid Christianity.
We take one scripture, Hebrews 10:25, and we turn it into forsake not the assembling of yourselves together, as is the habit of some, as the big proof text that you must go and sit in such a meeting. And yet, like you said, the church didn't know of such a meeting for 300 years. We didn't do it like we do it today. It was people in their homes sharing their faith, sharing their life together, encouraging each other. And so to me, the modality we have that we call church is not equatable to anything Jesus did in his 3.5, 4 years with us. We don't have him telling the boys to organize the Sunday morning or Saturday morning event. He didn't do anything that looks like what we think is absolutely essential today. And I just say it's not essential. It's not what you need. It's not what Jesus demonstrated with his boys. What he demonstrated was, I'll walk with you. We'll love, we'll talk, we'll share, we'll learn. That's what church life is. And all the other accoutrements we've added to it, honestly, if we took an honest look at it, I think it's largely for the business model.
So please join me with a returning guest from episode 30, a well-known author, co-author of The Shack, and a podcaster. as well, and that is Wayne Jacobson. It is a podcast not to be missed. Until then, cheerio.